But the first question is, last year, the government poured more than 1 billion into 19 out of the top 20 countries run by the world's most corrupt regimes, such as Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and North Korea. Tory MP Philip Davis has said, "This is a colossal waste of money. Do the panel agree, and what should we do about it?"
Thank you, Tom. I haven't read the piece in question. I don't think the money was necessarily going to the regimes or the governments in these corrupt countries. And I think what we have to consider is that the needs of the general populace in corrupt countries is likely to be much higher than in non-corrupt countries. There is a direct causation between the corrupt regime and starving people in need of our help. So I'd like to know exactly what the figures were before damning it or suggesting that the money has gone to the regimes. I think in countries like North Korea, we know what a desperate place that is and the starvation that exists there because of the policies of the regime there. I'd like to know what exactly the money was going to before we start judging it. I don't think it's being, as Suzanne said, going to prop up corrupt regimes. If it is, obviously that's scandalous, it shouldn't happen, but I don't know that it necessarily is. I think the 0.7% target, which has existed for some 35 years and was enshrined in the Millennium Development Goals that all the rich countries of the world committed to in order to try and halve poverty within a generation. I do agree that it is an arbitrary figure, but I think the sentiment behind it, the ambition of it, is something to be commended. We do need to know that the aid money we send abroad is effectively spent, that there is aid effectiveness. That's only fair because it makes sure that it's going to people who need it most, that it's having a material difference to people's lives. But also from the point of view of those who spend the money, who pay for the money in the first place, and this is I think the UKIP line, you need to have aid transparency to make sure that the taxpayers in this country know that it's going to the right people, that it's going to help people get out of poverty so they won't need our aid in future. And I think that's commendable and I think we should support it.
Thank you very much.
Peter Morgan. Poverty, you say it's in corrupt countries. Question one, what is the aid being, how is aid being used to address the bad governance in countries? Question two, I don't think it's true that corrupt equals poor. Ghana's quite a poor country, but it's not a corrupt country. Population growth is a major problem with poverty. What are we doing to address population growth? For example, the population of Nigeria went up 6 times in 50 years. If population is going to grow at that rate, how are we going to address poverty? What are we doing to address population growth? Why is the aid budget increasing when other budgets are cut or held? What's the justification for actually increasing the aid? And none of the panelists have explained how they will get aid spent effectively. Zimbabwe, corrupt country, brutal dictator in charge, ruthless control. How can we help the people in Zimbabwe without helping Mugabe stay in power? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. On the point on population growth, there's 2 points I'd like to make. One, which was actually you alluded to. Population growth rates are declining quite rapidly in the developing world. In this country, we used to have many, many children per couple, per woman. It took us actually centuries and decades to bring that number down. In the developing world, it's coming down very, very quickly indeed, because people are learning that larger families are more difficult to sustain. But there is a very fundamental reason why many families have large families, large amounts of children. It's because there are appalling infant death rates. People do not survive long enough. People see having children as a security, as an insurance against the future to provide them with sustenance when they get older. They feel they have to have more children because they're worried that some of them will not, many of them will not survive into adulthood. As the aid spend is effective and helps child health especially, I think people will see there is less of an incentive to have large families and the numbers will come down even faster. And just the other point I'd make about the link between poverty and corruption, I don't think we were suggesting that poor countries are necessarily corrupt or corrupt countries are necessarily poor, but there is very likely to be a strong causal link between the two in many parts of the world.
Is Trevor Davis in the audience?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Trevor. You asked three very good questions, and I'll start with the first, if I may. This is your statement. The EU is a racket that looks after its own. A true statement by Nigel Farage, especially in the context of the question, does charity begin at home? There is talk about the UK taxpayers paying towards EU pensions. Would one of the panelists like to make a comment, please?
I'll try and keep my comments brief and to the original statement that was made. I agree with Tom, absolutely. There are many positive aspects to the European Union in terms of when we work together on things, on consumer protection as an excellent example, on crime and security, and actually overseas aid, international aid is another area where collectively we can do far more than we could do individually. I think it's sad that other European Union countries haven't matched our efforts in terms of proportion of gross national income. There we go. But as for the overall comment as to whether or not it's a racket, I think the idea behind the EU, free movement of goods, capital, people and so forth is excellent. I think a lot of the ideals behind it are excellent. I think the way it's administered now is, I think a racket is a perfectly reasonable way to describe it. I think there is a terrible democratic deficit. I think its accounts haven't been signed off for, Suzanne will know this, 20 years or so?
Yep.
Yeah, something like that. So I think it's got problems. I think we need to reform it, and then we need to put the reformed EU to a referendum to the British people. And if we want to get out, well, we'll get out.
Thank you.
I have contributed, so I won't contribute again, but I would like to ask Matthew whether when he wrote speeches for the CBI about the EU, whether he ever called the EU a racket.
Well, it wasn't me making the speeches, so I'm sure I would never have put that word in the Director General's.
No, I'm sure.
But it might have been there in the subtext. And actually, I did write speeches about the European Union, and I criticised Michel Barnier, who was the Commissioner for Financial Services. And I said that some of his worst ideas were created by Laboratoire Barnier, and they were particularly damaging to one of this country's really great industries, which is financial services. So I wasn't against criticising them, or indeed putting the words in someone else's mouth, but I was normally skulking in the background somewhere. So had it been me, racket is a word I might well have used.
Is Leanne Bruni in the audience? Thank you, Leanne. Leanne's question is, 1 in 4 children in the UK live in poverty. Bearing this in mind, shouldn't our priority be eliminating poverty in the UK as opposed to abroad? Matthew?
Straight away, that's a figure of relative poverty. You cannot eliminate relative poverty. It's not possible. It's not absolute poverty they live in. So that's the problem with that figure. It's a very simple answer, but you can't eliminate relative poverty.
So if you can't eliminate relative poverty, then why are we trying to eliminate poverty around the world? Because that's relative.
That's absolute poverty.
Well, I think absolute poverty is the point. I mean, those on less than $1 a day or $1.10, whatever it is now. Yes. Yeah, but the point is, if you set a thing that says you are in poverty if your income is at 60% of the national average, which is how relative poverty is assigned, you're always going to have people who are in relative poverty. It's always going to happen. Yes. Well, the debate over this doesn't. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. To substantiate your figures there, Robert, 1 million children go to bed every night hungry. 900 billion people go to bed without clean water in the following morning. And 2.4 billion people don't have a toilet. So this is what we're comparing ourselves with. Those poor people that don't have water and don't have sanitation. Thank you, Robert.
Oh, okay. It's just one thing that's bothering me about all this poverty and everything, is that a lot of rich people, and especially rich foreign investors, are just buying up all our properties in England and just raking off money from there. And that means that people who live here actually can't afford to buy their own homes and can't afford to live. And that is increasing the poverty of this country. And what good is that doing to ordinary people? Is anything at all being done to stop this happening? Because it's really upsetting. I mean, it started off with people buying places in Cornwall, rich people buying places and then local people can't afford to buy. I personally think it ought to be illegal for foreigners to buy places here until they've lived here for at least 10 years. And I think that people shouldn't be able to just buy second homes and just rent them out. I don't believe in property for investment because it's making people homeless. It's just not fair. Stop people from buying who has, okay, I've got a £10 million house and I'm going to buy that flat as well, and I'm going to buy that flat, and I'm going to buy that flat, and so other people can't get them because the price goes up so much. Are you going to stop that? How? Well,
I'll say a couple of things. We've heard tonight some sort of acerbic comments about people from abroad coming here because they're on the scrounge. And now we're hearing comments about people who are coming here from abroad who are too rich and keep wanting to buy everything. I think it is wonderful that wealthy, successful people come to London, that they are wealth creators, that we have a very thriving financial services industry in London. I think it is unfortunate that it is perceived that the very small amounts of properties they buy in very expensive areas is a huge problem. The issue in fact is, as Tom rightly said, is a lack of supply at the other end of normal family homes, all the rest of it. The coalition government has in fact done something about this, in that stamp duty rates have gone up markedly on the most expensive properties. That means that those people who have the money to buy expensive properties pay far more in tax. Where I differ from the Liberal Democrats and Labour is I don't believe that those people who live in properties which happen to have become very valuable should pay large amounts of tax every year just because they happen to live in those properties. I think it's those who can afford to buy them, that's where it should come in, the stamp duty. But I think the other thing we have to remember is that an awful lot of British people own second properties abroad. And I think we have to be careful about saying that foreigners can't come here, because we want to go there as well. So this is what happens in an open market, it's what happens in a free society. I think there are a lot of good points to it, not just the few bad.
The question is from Raj Sood, and the question is, when will the government and the Labour Party listen to its 70 million citizens? Can the traditional parties not understand that we're simply fed up with foreign aid policy and the cuts that affect us here? When will you hear us? After the next coalition of UKIP and the Greens?
I just thought it's ironic that someone accuses other politicians of playing Punch and Judy politics. I mean, the sense of irony obviously lost in you, but there we go. I do think if we're going to talk about party politics, I'd hope we wouldn't. Actually, I'd hope we talk a little bit more tonight about international aid, but if we're going to talk about party politics, I must say I find UKIP to be a populist mob, really, all the time. They come up, they have very easy answers to very complicated, intractable problems, and I think people should be wary of that and look very carefully at the fine print, if there is any, and think very carefully about what is in their own long-term best interests. So I think, it's lovely that Nigel Farage can come out and say come up with a few bon mots and have a few pints, all the rest of it. But, this is more serious than that, frankly.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could spend another 2 hours quite easily, but sadly time won't permit it. I'd like to ask the audience their views. There's been a great deal of time spent about overseas aid. I'd like you to raise your hand if you feel that we should continue with the same level of overseas aid. Please raise your hand if you think we should. Oh, that's good. It's about 60–70%. Thank you very much indeed for attending. Thank you, panelists, for your excellent answers. And thank you very much for your questions. Good night.